Hey folks! Over the millennia of humanity's existence, we have used animals for food, clothing, transportation, and of course, companionship. The last major exhibition that I worked on at Point Ellis House was all about animals and pets in the 19th and 20th centuries. And over the course of working on that exhibition, I discovered a very specific niche of history that I have since become extremely passionate about. I threw myself into the research for this exhibit and I just kept wanting more. It was just so darn interesting. The exhibit turned out amazing, and to this day I think it is still one of the coolest things that I've ever had the privilege of working on. While the exhibit is completely finished now, I've kind of kept going with the research and learning more about the history of animals and pets. I have turned parts of this topic into a topic for an episode of the podcast I was a part of called Mortals. I've also given a talk on pets and animals in the 19th century for the Victoria Historical Society. And in the midst of all of this research in the last year and a half or so, I stumbled across a very sad and very interesting event that occurred in 1939. The event that I want to discuss today specifically has to do with pets and animal companions. In general, I find the history of pets to be extremely endearing, and it's a big part of the reason why I love humanity. Humans have kept animals for the purpose of comfort and company for a very long time. There is so much archaeological evidence of the love that people have had for their pets over the last several thousand years. For example, we discovered that the ancient Egyptians had a pet cemetery, and the Romans have left behind graves and epitaphs dedicated to their beloved furry friends who had passed away. The Victorians left behind diaries discussing new pets brought home for companionship, and I think something to keep in mind as we dive into this topic, the topic that I'm going to be discussing is a tragedy. It is going to be pretty sad, and it's a little bit upsetting, but my takeaway from this tragedy is love. The miscommunication and its tragic fallout was based in love and caring for a being other than ourselves. Today, I want to tell you about the British Pet Massacre of 1939. It all started with a pamphlet. In September of 1939, the Second World War, as we call it in Canada, had just begun. Germany was on the move across Europe, and many people's worst fears were being realized. The war had begun, and very soon it would be on people's doorsteps. Shortly after the war began, an organization called the National Air Raid Precautions Animals Committee, or NARPAC for short, was formed in England. They were created to provide instruction and guidance to the general public on how to care for their pets or their livestock in the case of an air raid. I just have to say, in general, the entire history of animal welfare is extremely interesting, but I just want to make it clear that NARPAC was not the only animal charity during the Second World War that was operating to make sure that animals were being treated appropriately during wartime. You also had the Our Dumb Friends League, yes, that's a real name, that later became the Blue Cross, which was like the animal equivalent of the Red Cross, which is for humans. You also had the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or the SPCA, which has offshoots as far as here in British Columbia. All of these leagues and charities and organizations were telling the people of Britain the same thing. Hey, there's a war coming. Plan for your pets accordingly. Send them off with your kids to the countryside, send them off with your relatives, give them to your neighbors, drop them off at a shelter. Just do what you need to do to make sure that they are out of the major cities that are most at risk of air raids. NARPAC had a slightly different approach though. They put out a pamphlet that was saying very similar things to what everybody else was saying, but they took it a step further. The advice from the pamphlet read, "If at all possible, send or take your household animals into the country in advance of an emergency." It concluded, if you cannot place them in the care of neighbors, it really is kindest to have them destroyed. The pamphlet also conveniently had an advertisement for a captive bolt pistol, which was believed to be a humane way of putting down animals back then. The advice in this pamphlet was repeated in newspapers and magazines across Britain, going so far as to even echo across the radio waves of the BBC. Many people acted on this advice. At this time, there were very prominent rumors spreading across England about possible incoming food shortages. The war had just begun and people were very unsure of how things were going to develop. So many people took their furry and feathered friends on one-way trips to vet hospitals. People were worried and they were scared and they did what they thought was right. A lot of people still remembered what it was like during the First World War. They remembered the starving cats and dogs wandering the streets, having either been abandoned or orphaned due to the circumstances of war. And of course, they didn't want to see it happen to their own beloved animals. There was also a large percentage of people who saw their pet as a luxury that they could no longer afford. Another mouth to feed during wartime could have a heavy price. But regardless of their reasons, many people across Britain took the advice of the pamphlet. The week after the pamphlet was released and its words were echoed across the country, massive lineups began to grow outside of vet hospitals. In the first 4 days, it is believed that 400,000 cats and dogs were put down. Crematoriums were suddenly overwhelmed, and with the sudden blackout measures that were now being implemented, they couldn't run at night. They needed all sources of light to be damped out, and so they could only run during the day. After the initial panic of those first few weeks, many people realized that they had made a mistake. The food shortages were not as imminent as the rumors had made it seem like, and London would not be bombed for another year. There was a lull in pet euthanizations after that first week of panic, but after London was bombed in 1940, there was another massive swell, another big push to take animals down to the vet hospitals to be put down. In memoriam posts in newspapers and magazines began to appear very shortly thereafter. Happy memories of Viola, sweet faithful friend, given sleep September 4th, 1939, to be saved suffering during the war. A short but happy life. 2 years, 12 weeks. Forgive us, little pal. I think the most heartbreaking aspect of this story is the fact that most of the people who did not act on the advice of the NARPAC pamphlet, most of their pets survived the war. These were not government-ordered deaths. The government was not asking anybody to put down their pets. People were scared and they were desperate. There was opposition to this pet call by many of the pet and animal charity organizations that I mentioned earlier, including that of the Royal SPCA. There were dozens and dozens of shelters across Britain that did what they could to save pets not only from the war, but also from this pet call. The Battersea Dogs and Cats Home managed to feed and care for 145,000 dogs during this time. The Duchess of Hamilton, a known cat lover, did what she could to bring animals from London, at first to her home, before establishing a sanctuary out of an airplane hangar in Fern. The animals that were taken to the vet hospitals to be euthanized were either buried or cremated on the little properties associated with these hospitals, but many of them were very quickly at capacity. Once it was becoming clear in London in particular that there was no room to continue burying pets, one sanatorium offered an attached meadow where it is believed that 500,000 pets that were euthanized during this time are buried. Pets are often left behind during times of war. We have seen this as recently as last year with the escalation of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Some people released their animals to give them a fighting chance at survival, and shelters were being overwhelmed with pets that people one day hoped they could come back for. The decisions made by people last year and the decisions made by people in 1939 were not done out of malice. And I think that's part of why this is so tragic. In moments of extreme trial and despair, we do our best. We are only human. I don't personally know how I would react in these situations, and I hope I never have to find out. If you have a pet, I highly suggest that you make sure you include it in all of your emergency planning, whether it's for floods or fires. I live in an earthquake-prone zone, and I have a small earthquake kit that I have put together for me and my partner, and there are some things in there for my cat, Beans. Also, in case me or my partner aren't home and a natural disaster strikes, I have also informed my neighbor of where Bean's leash and harness is so that she can very quickly grab him if possible and if necessary. This is a very heavy topic, but we made it through it. And if you have a pet, please go and give them a squeeze for me and go have a snack, have a glass of water or a cup of tea. I'm going to include some clips at the end of this video of my cat Beans as a way to kind of help cleanse the end of this video and, you know, kind of put a happy spin on it. You learned about a sad, tragic thing that happened in history today. Here's my cat. But hopefully these clips of him being a goober will help with the after effect of learning about this very sad topic. Wherever you are, please look after yourself, and I will see you next time.